laws are placed into our laws.
Just wondered if the Victorians thought otherwise, you know, what the reason was for that. Obviously, they thought differently because they put it in, or they linked the two together.
Yeah, look, I presume they might have been when they created the Victorian Charter, that sense of balance in terms of like with rights come responsibility. So I presume that would have been part of their thinking about why it was described that way and structured that way. But it's worth mentioning that ACT and Queensland, they don't have a rights and responsibilities. They call it in both of those places a Human Rights Act. And theirs is more focused on enshrining those human rights in their laws. So I think it's fair to say that whilst Victoria took one path, and you know that's perfectly fine in my view, ACT and Queensland took another path. And in my opinion, if you look at the detail of what we're trying to do and where the need is, that pathway of focusing on the human rights that are not currently in our laws is the higher priority.
Okay, if anyone, when you ask a question, just unmute yourself and then mute yourself again when you've asked it. Okay. Wendy.
Yeah, Danny, two of the things in your initial introduction really resonated with me. And one was the fact that we're the only Western country that doesn't have some form of a Charter of Human Rights. And the other was that it was actually discussed at Federation. And I wonder if you, and I'm sure many others, think that one of the reasons for both those things or contributing factors could have been terra nullius, the fact that Australia was sort of, well, white Australia formed on that lie of terra nullius. Do you think that's part of it? And that would lead on to, if we can move some way towards changing that, it could help towards introduction of a human rights charter.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful question. Thank you so much for that. So I think there's a couple of things to bear in mind. The first one is there is obviously a major push in our society right now to ensure that the statement from the heart that was made in 2017 and was presented to all sides of politics on the federal level gets taken seriously and adopted as swiftly as possible. Our campaign obviously is not involved in that particular conversation, and there's one very important reason why. That conversation is basically one which is being led by Aboriginal controlled organisations and groups, and obviously if they would like the Charter of Human Rights campaign to be involved in it, then obviously it'd be our pleasure to provide support for that. But ultimately, we don't want to be in a situation where there's any sense about us trying to shoehorn an Australian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms into that important step towards ensuring that we have genuine justice and reconciliation for First Nations communities and peoples that have been denied for them ever since 1788. So very much it's something which is in a separate realm. So just to be clear about that particular point. But one of the things that a Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms does need to do is implement the values and the rights that are there when it comes to First Nations peoples, because they're the ones who are the most disadvantaged in our society, which comes back to why haven't we had this in our laws for so long? Because ultimately, those communities are the ones who have the most disadvantage, have seen the most discrimination and exploitation, and the least recourse for taking action, because obviously there is the Racial Discrimination Act, but that only deals with areas of explicit discrimination. And as we know, the intervention, they even suspended the operation of the Racial Discrimination Act in order to do that. But the Racial Discrimination Act is no longer being excluded, and yet we're still seeing like epic levels of discrimination and exploitation and disadvantage. So I think we really do need a situation where we need to ensure that we do have those rights for First Nations communities. But it's important to remember that this is a problem for everyone in our society. Not to say that First Nations communities are on an equivalence in terms of the dispossession and disadvantage they face compared to, say, people with disabilities or elderly Australians or people seeking asylum, but rather a case of there are so many different parts of our community that need to have their respect, have respect when it comes to their rights being upheld and being honoured. And First Nations communities definitely need it the most. The other thing that's also worth mentioning about human rights is the fact that ultimately, why don't people in places of power want those human rights upheld and respected and enforced? And that's the whole point about the Federation debates. Like, they're concerned that if you put those human rights in there, who would it apply to? And so that's why our Constitution not only doesn't have many human rights in it, it also has explicit provisions at that time to allow for discriminatory actions to take place. Our Constitution to this day still has the ability for the federal government to pass a law that excludes people from being able to vote on the basis of their race, which is extraordinary. It's still there right now. So we have a lot of renovations to do when it comes to our Constitution. But what I also know is that making constitutional change is quite a difficult process, as people will be familiar with. And if we're going to expend energy on that sort of constitutional change, the higher priority is quite rightly the statement from the heart and the call coming from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities on that front, which is another reason why I think calling for a legislative charter of human rights and freedoms is the best thing for us to be doing right now when it comes to entrenching and enshrining those values in our laws.
Thank you.
What more can we do as an organisation and as individuals? I mean, we've been sharing the petition around and Facebook, but yeah, I mean, it's obviously a really important issue for our campaign. What can we do?
Thank you so much for that question. That's a really important question. So I think there's a couple of things. One is, I think, something which is really interesting, which is Rural Australians Refugees did a series of videos showing why there should be a Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. And it had people who were in our community, who were people seeking asylum, people seeking safety, who were voicing those in those videos. So one of the things that I might suggest is help amplify those videos, because I think that was really good videos that Rural Australians Refugees did, and I think that would be something of particular interest for grandmothers refugees in terms of like directly relevant to the priorities that grandmothers refugees have right now. So I think that's one thing you can do, help spread that word. The second thing is, of course, that issue of getting more people to be involved in that push, because one of the problems we have with a Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms is there's not enough people who know about it. We have more people who know about it, then that is great news. One of the things we did with research 2 years ago is we discovered that a lot of people in our community, they support human rights, but they don't think human rights is a problem in Australia. They think it's an overseas thing. So for them, like, the logical reaction when it comes to improving human rights is, oh, okay, I'll donate to a charity involved in international development work, which is like, okay, that's great, you're supporting international development work, but that's actually not, like there are human rights problems here, which we also need to be dealing with. So getting that word out to more people, I think, is another important thing. And then the final thing, I think, is about those opportunities to speak up when it comes to the issues that do come up in the political debate. So one of the things that we did last year was when the Senate was doing an inquiry into COVID-19, we actually put in a submission to the Senate COVID-19 inquiry to call for an Australian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms as one of the things that should be recommended by the Senate as part of making sure that we have a better response to future pandemics and health crises. So being more involved in those processes to ensure our political leaders hear about Australian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, what those benefits are, I think is a really important thing. And one of the things I'm very happy to keep the organisation up to speed on in terms of those opportunities when they arise.
I think China recently reported Australia to the UN for breach of human rights. It's interesting.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? The problem we have is Australia has been a long-term advocate for human rights in many parts of the world. As I mentioned earlier, Doc Evatt, Australia's Foreign Minister in 1948, and his critical role in the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But obviously, if you put forward a standard in the public debate, that's a standard that you'll be held to as well. So that's not to say that I think that China, the People's Republic of China, is like doing great things when it comes to human rights. They're doing horrible things, absolutely horrific things when it comes to human rights. The problem we've got is that we shouldn't have to leave it to to authoritarian governments engaged in gross human rights violations on their own people to raise these issues in Australia. We have the ability to be able to be calling on our government to do better when it comes to human rights here, so that when we are speaking up in international forums, we're speaking from a position of moral strength.
Who are the sympathetic politicians on both sides, and should we be writing to them and encouraging them?
I think that's an important point, in terms that there are a number of politicians that have spoken up about Australian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms already. And I'm very happy to talk offline to go through that in any detail when it comes to political lobbying effort to help expand those numbers of people. But I think that the important thing is to make that ask broadly. And the reason why I say that is because there are some politicians that are opponents, of course, but there are plenty who have no position on this at all. And for many of them, it's for novel reason that no one's raised with them. So they've had to think about it. Politicians, they have so many things they have to worry about and prioritize and engage in. I'm not so surprised if some of them haven't heard about what the Australian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, what it actually is, what it means, and what benefits it provides for everyone in our community. So I think it's about talking broadly about Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms and see what response you receive. And from that, get to work out if we're getting additional supporters for a campaign, or for those who are undecided, what are the sort of things that they want to find out more about, or things that they're not sure about, but they're keen to resolve before they decide to support a Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. Those politicians are certainly out there across the political spectrum. And to my mind, that engagement with them is an important piece. But I also know that politicians are most keen on making sure they reflect the views of their community. And so for me, another priority is making sure we have this conversation more in our community and more people in the community support it, because it's not just persuading a politician that this is the right thing to do, it's also showing them that as representatives, this is what their community wants them to be doing as well.
Can I just add something? You said before that under our current government, we could decide, or they could decide, that a certain race in our country can't vote. That's possible. It shocked me. And maybe the way to approach this for some of those people who are undecided is, as well as having a list of all the charters that we do have that contribute to a Charter of Human Rights, having a list of things that could be done without one, so that we can see the damage that could be done without a Charter of Rights.
Thanks for that. So I reckon there's something that's worth mentioning about this, and that is that one of the things that I've found when it comes to talking about the problems we have in our society and how to improve a Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms is making sure we talk about the values. And let me explain what I mean by that. So when it comes to press freedom, when those raids happened 2 years ago, many of the media organizations and people advocating for press freedom, they had a very clear set of urgent asks that they were seeking government to do to protect press freedom, like a shield law to protect journalists from being raided by the police, protections for whistleblowers to make sure that people who do speak up in the public interest do not have some protection from official secret laws and things along those lines. A Charter of Rights was part of the call, but there were other things that were the urgent priority. So when it comes to Section 25 of the Australian Constitution, the thing that's worth mentioning about that is, I think that's just terrible, of course. But the reason I was putting forward was illustrative of the issue of where the framers of our Constitution were thinking back in the 1890s. And they had many things that they were thinking about, and unfortunately, one of them was thinking in a discriminatory way, a way which we wouldn't find acceptable today. And as part of that sort of thinking, that was an argument against putting forward human rights more clearly and more broadly in our Constitution.